Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our commencement ceremony for the PhD graduates who belong to the 27th and 28th cycle, and they just completed their path. There were 11 students who completed their path this year. Some of these students were funded by the University of Trento through scholarship from the University of Trento. And these students were Giulia Frey, who was supervised by Nathan Weiss, Elisa Infanti, who was supervised by Massimo Turatto, Daniel Kaiser, who was supervised by Marius Pilin, Seth Levin, supervised by Jens Schwarzbach, Raffaele Tucciarelli, supervised by Angelica Lingnau, Yuan Tao, supervised by Massimo Poesio, and James Francis Hartzell, supervised by Uri Asson. Then we also had students that were supervised by external fellowships. And in particular, two students, Vania Marisa Correa de Aguiar and Adria Rof Sanchez, were funded by an Erasmus Mundus fellowship, Erasmus Mundus Master Program in clinical experimental approaches to language. And they were supervised by Gabriele Miceli. Alba Noel Finnerty was funded by an FBK fellowship and was supervised by Fabio Pianesi. And Tafik Nassef was supervised by Stefano Panzeri and was supported by an IIT fellowship. Also, I should say that James Francis Hartzell was a recipient of a fellowship of the ITPAR consortium, so India Trento Program for Advanced Research. I'm emphasizing this to show how the many students that we have the opportunity to supervise and that we had to follow over the last 3-4 years were actually funded by different institutions, and we're very grateful to all these institutions. The students work on very different topics, all related to cognitive neuroscience, and they all came from very different backgrounds. So they came from psychology, but they also came from mathematics, from a background in linguistics, from a background on a very different domain like the study of Sanskrit. So I think this characterizes well the multidisciplinary nature of our program, and I think it characterizes well also the way in which different expertise can contribute to the study of mind and brain. So our distinguished speaker today, that I'm really, really glad to introduce now, is Professor Robert Zatorre. Professor Zatorre obtained his undergraduate training at Boston University, where he completed dual degrees in music and psychology, as I understand, working as an organist also. I like this aspect because one thing that we often repeat to our students is the fact that the passion that you have as a student can well become the passion that leads your research throughout life. And in this case, I think it's extremely well represented, because if the topic of neuroscience of music has become a well-studied and well-affirmed topic now in cognitive neuroscience, is largely owed to Professor Zatorre and his colleagues, but Professor Zatorre was clearly one of the founders of this topic. He obtained his PhD in experimental psychology at Brown University, and then he continued with the neuropsychological training with Brenda Milner at the Montreal Neurological Institute, and then he remained at McGill University, where he is now James Gill Professor of Neuroscience at the Montreal Neurological Institute and associate member of the Department of Psychology. His research covered many different topics with this amazingly sometimes ignored but beautiful sensory modality that is audition. His research deals with auditory perceptual processes, in particular musical sounds and speech, but he also worked on spatial hearing, cross-modal plasticity, anatomical measures of auditory cortex using a wide range of techniques. As I said, he is undoubtedly one of the founders of the research field of neuroscience of music, and in 2006 he became the founding co-director of the International Laboratory for Brain, Music and Sound Research, which has one of the most brilliant acronyms I've ever heard about, the BRAMS. I thought, this is just ideal. He received many prizes and awards, well, he has over 27,000 citations for his work and considerable attention from the media. And the title of his talk today is From Perception to Pleasure, Music and its Neural Substrates. Please help me to welcome Professor Robert Zatorre.
Grazie, buonasera. Prima di tutti, congratulazioni a tutti i laureati. E questo è tutto l'italiano che vuoi parlare. So it's a wonderful pleasure and honor to be here. I'm very, very pleased. I think it's a very special event. It's not just a lecture, but it's really for all of the graduates and also all of the students who eventually will graduate. I think it's really important to sort of celebrate all of what you have done, but also to see how neuroscience can touch upon so many different topics. And this is one of the things that makes neuroscience so exciting, I think, is that it's really not limited. It's essentially all of the human experience can be understood in some respects by looking at it from the point of view of neuroscience. Maybe not understood completely, but neuroscience is something to contribute, I think, to really all aspects of human experience, and that's what makes it so valuable and so prominent. And in my case, I hope to convince you of this from the perspective of looking at music. So I want to start with a sort of a little bit of introduction, which is not so much about neuroscience, but just to place the question into perspective a little bit for you. And so music, turns out, is not a recent development of the human species. It appears to be extremely ancient. And one of the reasons we know this is from the work of archaeologists who have been able to identify very ancient musical instruments. So for example, these flutes that you see here were discovered in a cave in China about 15 years ago or so. And they have the distinction that they can still be played. So there's something like 4,000 or 5,000 years old, and they're still playable. And this is what they sound like. They sound just quite beautiful, don't they? And it's really remarkable because that is really the sound that the ancient people would have heard. And furthermore, the scale structure is predicated on the distance between the holes of the flute. So we know that that is the scale. We don't know what music exactly was played on it, of course. There were no recordings or, no MP3 files were found next to the flutes, but we can still play them so we can have some idea of what they sound like. This was discovered in '99, but in fact, more recently, and closer to here, actually, in the Danube Valley, some even more ancient flutes were found. These date back to the Upper Paleolithic period, at a time when a good part of Northern Europe was still under glaciation. And yet, these people who were presumably, barely surviving, still took the time to find the right bones from animals and carve holes in them very carefully to produce these remarkable sounds. And what I think is that if these instruments were already being constructed 40,000 years ago, that means that a musical system must have antedated these instruments by a very long time period, by tens of thousands of years, presumably, because you wouldn't construct the instrument unless there was already a musical system there to support it, right? So that means that music is really, really part of our species, or in another way of putting it is that it's part of our original human mental machinery. And so it means that it must be an essential part of our nervous system as well. And I'm not really going to talk about the evolution of music. I'm not an evolutionary psychologist. But again, just to put it into perspective, I want to give you a very famous quote by Darwin, who in The Descent of Man said the following. He said, "As neither the enjoyment nor the capacity of producing music are faculties of the least direct use to humans, they must be ranked amongst the most mysterious with which we are endowed." So in other words, he was just saying, I have no idea what music is for or why it's there. I can't explain it. That was in 1871. But 10 years later, he wrote in his autobiography a very interesting statement, which goes as follows. He said, "If I had to live my life again, I would have made it a rule to read some poetry and listen to some music at least once every week, for perhaps the parts of my brain now atrophied would have been kept active through use." Which is an interesting statement because it's sort of suggesting something about neural plasticity or maybe even recovery. And then he says the following: "The loss of these tastes," meaning the loss of music and other aesthetic pleasures, "is a loss of happiness and may be injurious to the intellect and to the moral character by enfeebling the emotional part of our nature." And I think in this statement, he's sort of answering the question that he was unable to answer. Thank you, that's a little easier to read, I hope. He's sort of answering the question that he had been unable to answer 10 years earlier. So he's essentially saying that music is important for the emotional part of our nature. So let's take that idea and see what we can do with it. So music has a lot to do with the communication and the expression of emotion, as well as the regulation of mood and emotional states. And I think this is quite likely why music has been around for so long and why it's so ubiquitous in human societies. But this poses a big puzzle, because why is it that music gives us emotions? And there's a wide range of emotions, of course, that music can elicit. Today I'm really going to concentrate on pleasure, and some people will argue that's not even an emotion, but at least it's a very important part of music which is experimentally tractable, and you'll see why. So we can ask the question, why is it that music gives us pleasure? Because it's based on patterns of individual elements, each of which is in itself devoid of any meaning, but by combining them using a set of rules, we can generate these emotional states, and pleasure in particular, and yet it's completely abstract. So unlike speech, which also consists of combinatorial patterns of individual elements, which conveys emotion mostly by denoting particular events, right? So I can tell you something, I can tell you a story, it'll make you sad, it'll make you happy, but it's the content of the story. Whereas with music, it's completely abstract. It isn't the content, it's something else. So that is the question that we're going to try to understand. And essentially in my talk today, I will suggest three, or I'll go through three points. The first one is to look at some of the neural mechanisms associated with the processing of music itself. Then I'll move on to looking at the neural mechanisms associated with pleasure or reward, motivation, and related systems. And the first one is basically cortical in nature. And the second one is largely subcortical. And at the end, I will suggest that it's the interactions between those two systems that are the source of pleasure in music, and perhaps the source of aesthetic pleasure in general. So let's move on to look at some of these brain mechanisms. So here is a schematic of what goes on in the case of playing music. Let's see, this is point, yes. So I don't know if you can see that pointer, but music is an interesting phenomenon from the point of view that it involves both motor actions. So as you're playing music, you have to control your muscles, to produce a certain effect. So it consists both of motor actions and of sensory inputs, and obviously interactions between those systems. And although we cannot put, to study this, we can't really put a violinist inside an MRI scanner. We can put a cellist in an MRI scanner. And so we've actually built the world's only MR-compatible cello, which you see there. And this is my student, Melanie Segato, who is a professional cellist by night and a neuroscientist by day. And here she is inside the scanner. We have a very tiny bow. It's about this long. So, you can't play the entire Dvorak concerto, but you can play a few notes. And we can actually look at some of these neural systems. Here are data from cellists, and you see auditory cortical regions as well as premotor and parietal zones. I'll come back to this idea of musical performance in a moment. But just to give you a close-up on the actual neural circuitry, we can identify the auditory cortex, which is shown in red here in the superior part of the temporal lobe. And then there are various connections to regions up in the so-called dorsal stream, as well as regions in so-called ventral stream, and various interconnections to the motor system. A much more schematized version of this arrangement is shown here. So in color are the areas of auditory cortex. These are the locations where information comes in from the medial geniculate nucleus, which is the auditory relay in the thalamus. And roughly speaking, you've got two pathways, one more ventral and one more dorsal. And what I'll try to do is show you some evidence from our lab where we've identified some of the relevant properties of both the core and belt areas of the auditory cortex, as well as some of the ventral and dorsal streams. And we think that these are the important pathways for musical perception and production. Staying with a kind of a historical point of view, one of the first pieces of evidence that we have for musical processing comes from Wilder Penfield, who is the person who built our institute, which is shown at the back here of the stamp. And he, as you probably know, was famous for doing these studies on the exposed human cortex during procedures for epilepsy. And he's most well known for identifying the sensory and motor regions, the so-called homunculus. But he also identified these interesting hallucinations. So on occasion, when patients were stimulated along the superior temporal gyrus, they would report that they would hear music. And sometimes it was very vivid. So in one case, for example, the patient said, "Oh, I hear music. Did someone bring in a radio to the operating theater? And, what's up with that? Why is there a radio here?" So it was very, very realistic. And these only occurred with stimulation of the superior temporal gyrus and not elsewhere in the brain, and more often from the right than from the left. And so that was one of the first pieces of evidence that maybe there's some kind of stored representations of musical information somewhere in this auditory cortical system, such that when you stimulate that region with an electrode, you elicit this information that was somehow stored there and was ready to be elicited. Now we zoom forward, so that was in the 1960s. Now we zoom forward 30 years or so to one of the first neuroimaging experiments with music, which I carried out back in the early 1990s. And I created these little melodies. If you were to hear them, you would see why I decided on a career in neuroscience and not a career in music. In fact, this is the first and only one of my musical compositions that has ever been published. Journal of Neuroscience, 1994. I think it was also the first time the Journal of Neuroscience ever published any music. So that's kind of a distinction. But in those days, we were just looking at very simple paradigms, just looking at brain activity when you hear patterns of sounds. And we had a matched control condition. I won't go into the details. But essentially, we see a response in the superior temporal gyrus, here, horizontal view, here in a coronal view, with a stronger response on the right. There is one on the left, too, but it's not as strong. So this is one of the first studies where we were able to demonstrate that there might be some specialization for the processing of these tonal patterns in this particular region. We zoom forward yet again to a very recent paper from one of my former PhD students, Mike Klein. And here what we were doing is investigating auditory cortex, but using a rather more sophisticated paradigm than we were able to use in the 1990s. And that is using a multivariate approach where we use an algorithm known as a pattern classifier, which allows us to identify areas of the brain that encode information about a particular stimulus or about a particular stimulus class. In this case, our stimulus class was musical intervals. So if you hear this pattern of tones, if you're a musician, you would know that that is a minor third, and it sounds different than a major third, and it sounds different than a perfect fourth. But if you're a reasonably trained musician, you know that all of these three sounds are all minor thirds. So this is a D and an F, okay, Re and Fa. It's the same interval as this one. They're both minor thirds. Just like this is a major third, okay? So it's not the individual tones, it's the relationship between them. So it's the frequency ratio between these two tones that defines a musical interval. And so we tested highly trained musicians who know what these intervals are, and we looked all over the brain to see if there are voxels whose activity profile encodes the informational content associated with the minorness or the majorness or the fourthness, in other words, the category and not the individual tones. And we found these regions. I don't know if you can see that, but there's a cluster of voxels here in the superior temporal sulcus, so just in the ventral part of the superior temporal gyrus, which you see here. And this region is able to, it encodes information such that when we look at that area, we can figure out which interval the person was listening to with a certain degree of accuracy. We cannot, however, decode which pitch level they were listening to. So in other words, this part of the brain doesn't care about the individual tones, it cares about the relationship between those two tones. And therefore, I argue that it is a more abstract level of representation, because it's not just the frequency information, but rather the relationship between those frequencies, which in turn is something that you've learned, if you're a musician, by virtue of your training. Okay, so what else does the auditory cortex do? It turns out that it is also sensitive to violations of expected patterns, which I think is an important feature. So I'm going to play you another one of my very marvelous compositions. And in this case, I want you to raise your hand as soon as you notice that something strange has happened, that there's an event that doesn't seem to belong there. Okay, some of you have amusia, but those of you who responded correctly. And so when we do this, so we just play these melodies, and sometimes there are wrong notes that are introduced, and we see a response in auditory cortex that's sensitive to the violation. The interesting thing here is that the only way that you know it's a violation is not because you've heard this before. It's like I said, it's something that I composed for this experiment, and it's not available on Spotify or on iTunes. So when you listen to this and you notice that there's something wrong, it's not by virtue of your explicit knowledge of this particular pattern, it's by virtue of some kind of global knowledge that you have, some kind of implicit learning. Over your lifetime, you've heard thousands of melodies that are of a similar nature, that have a similar structure, and so you have encoded those regularities, and your auditory cortex, presumably, is part of that system where that information has been encoded, such that when you violate what's expected, you get a response. There's also, I don't have the time to show you, but there's also responses in the frontal cortex, which are very important. Auditory cortex is also relevant for yet another feature, which I think is very, very relevant for not only for musically trained people, but for everyone, which is musical imagery. And we can define this as the ability to evoke music in the mind's ear, even when it's not physically present. The best example of this is from Beethoven, who, as you know, became very, very deaf late in his life, and yet was able to write magnificent music. We know he was really deaf, even though no one did an audiogram in the 18th century, because these conversation books are preserved. And what this represents is that when people went to talk to Beethoven in the latter part of his life, even if they shouted into his ear, he could not hear anything. So they had to write down their questions for him, which he could then read and then respond to. So he was really very, very deaf. Now, we don't have Beethoven to scan, but we do have highly trained musicians. But you can actually demonstrate the same effect without using highly trained musicians. Even non-musicians show something similar. And essentially what we have here in the orange are the responses in auditory cortex when actually hearing a musical pattern. And in green is the area which is responsive also when you are imagining that same musical pattern. So this is done in silence. There's no actual stimulus. We ask people, we have various tasks to do this. We ask people to imagine those sounds, and there's an overlap between the orange area, which is the real sound evoked response, which is the entirety of auditory cortex, and these green zones, which are mostly found in the belt and parabelt areas of auditory cortex. So what this means is that these more downstream regions of the auditory system must have perceptual templates that are stored, because you're able to invoke this music when cued, and this is perhaps reminiscent of what was happening with Penfield's patients, where an electrical current, when it's passed through some of those same areas, also evokes a response, although a much more vivid one than the one that's evoked in an imagery context. Okay, so I've shown you some of the properties of the auditory cortex and the associated areas in terms of functional responses. So everything I've shown you so far has been brain activity patterns. We can also look at specializations that might emerge for the specialized ability that musicians have. And for that, we're going to look primarily at anatomical imaging. And I'm just giving you some examples of these phenomena. So this is from some work done by Patrick Bermudez in my lab. And here we used a measure of cortical thickness. So the colors here represent a scale of enhanced thickness of the cortical mantle when comparing a group of trained musicians versus a group of matched individuals who don't have any training. And what we see are areas as we would expect. So areas of the auditory cortex, which have greater cortical thickness, as well as areas of the motor cortex. And we also see a lot of activity going on in the frontal cortex, which is perhaps somewhat surprising, but I think it speaks to the those loops that I was showing you earlier in terms of the connections coming in from auditory cortex, ending up in the premotor and the frontal regions. We also see, this is from some work done by Chris Steele and Virginia Penhune, we also see changes in the white matter of musicians. And in this particular experiment, we were looking at the connectivity between the motor regions. So if we just look at probabilistic tractography in this particular region, what we see is that there are differences between musicians and non-musicians, but in this particular measure, those differences are linked to the age at which training begins. So I don't know if you can see this graph very well, but this is fractional anisotropy, which is a measure of the white matter integrity, if you will, or white matter microstructure. And musicians who were trained relatively early scored much more highly in this area on this measure than musicians who trained relatively later or than non-musicians. And what's important here is that all of the people who were scanned were all adults, and they all had the same total number of years of training, and they all had the same current total hours of practice. So they're all equally, shall I say, they're all equally hard at work in terms of practicing, and they've all had the same number of years, but some of them started earlier, before age 7, and the others started later, after age 7. And it seems like the age at which you begin the training makes a big difference. This is simply a regression showing the age of onset, and you can see that those people who started between the ages of 4 and 7 are the ones who have the highest fractional anisotropy in that location compared to those who started later. And this, of course, explains why I'm a failed musician, because I think I'm somewhere one of these points over here. So I started a bit too late, probably. So the auditory cortex and all its connections, I think, is important for a number of cognitive and perceptual processes which are essential for our ability to perceive and produce music. So they allow us to encode, obviously, individual sound features like pitch or duration, but also the relationships between those elements. So you can encode not only sensory inputs, but also relational information, which is essential for having anything like a musical system. The same areas of cortex are also sensitive to regularities, as I showed you in some of those studies. And what that means is that if those regularities are encoded, it means that you can create expectancies, which means you can predict what's coming. And that turns out to be very important. I'll come back to that concept later on. These same circuits are also important for the retrieval and the playout of stored representations. So this is also what allows you to have imagery, is that the information is encoded in these systems and can be played out at a particular time depending on the needs. And finally, this whole system is also enhanced with musical training. So we see evidence of anatomical changes that indicate that there's enhancement, and that allows us to have musical performance. And of course, you can't have perception without having performance. Sometimes people forget that, but both elements are extremely important. So you may be wondering, what does all of this have to do with pleasure? Because up until now, we've only spoken about these perceptual and motor and cognitive kinds of mechanisms, but none of it seems to have any link to pleasure or emotion. So in this second half of the talk, I want to tell you a little bit about this. And to introduce the topic, I want to tell you a little bit about what some people have suggested about music and pleasure throughout history. So I've found a couple of interesting quotes. So this one is from St. Augustine, who, as you may know, if you're Italian or if you were raised in some kind of Catholic tradition, maybe you studied the Confessions of St. Augustine. This is from volume 33. He had a lot to confess about because he lived a very exciting life, and then at the end sort of thought that maybe he should come clean on some of what he did. And he has the following statement about music in relation to music used in the church. And so he says the following: I fluctuate between the peril of pleasure and approved wholesomeness, inclined to approve of the usage of singing in the church, that so, by the delight of the ears, the weaker minds may rise to the feeling of devotion. Yet, when it befalls me to be more moved with the voice than the words sung, I confess to have sinned penally, and then had rather not hear music. Now, this is a very insightful statement. We're talking about the 4th century AD. And St. Augustine totally gets it. He understands that if you're going to have singing in the context of a religious service, that's very good, because the singing is powerful and will make some people, maybe people who otherwise wouldn't understand about devotion to God, would make them become closer to God. However, he understands that sometimes the music is itself so beautiful that he forgets about the content, the text, And he's just in love with the music. And that's a sin, because it takes him away from God, right? So he understands the power of music, right? A more blunt statement about a similar idea was articulated by this gentleman, whom you may remember from the 1970s. He said, "Music corrupts the minds of our youth. There is no difference between music and opium. Both create lethargy in different ways." Now, there's a lot of debate about whether the opioid system is actually involved in music. There's some evidence that it might be. I'll argue that the dopaminergic system is involved. So this is rather sophisticated, coming from a non-neurochemist. But I think he's also onto something here, that if you are going to run a society that doesn't deviate in any way from what you want people to do, then things like music are dangerous, because it might take away your power, because music is itself very powerful. So if you want to be the powerful guy and tell everyone what to do, you might not want to have music. In fact, Khomeini argued that music should be banned, and the Taliban famously attempted to do this, although with only limited success when they were in charge in Afghanistan. So music is indeed statistically can be shown to be a very high source of pleasure for most people. This is from a survey done by a colleague of mine who asked McGill students to endorse the following statements as sources of pleasure. So they were asked about romance or about sex. 98% said yes, they get pleasure from those things. Also from success. 96% said sun. Now, if you have gone to Montreal in the winter, you know that this is kind of an important thing. Music comes up in the top 5 or 10 items. 95% of people say it gives them pleasure. That's higher than grades, or food, or money, or sports, or art. Much higher than art, in fact. So music seems to be a very common source of pleasure. And so that leads us to look at the literature, and there's a vast neuroscience literature on pleasure and reward. And some of you may be more familiar with this literature than I am. But if we look at the kinds of stimuli that give rise to pleasure, we see that there are quite a lot of different ones, which can be very rewarding. Now, I know that some of you are graduating, and you may have a big party tonight, so I don't know if you're going to be doing any of these, but try not to do all of them on the same evening, because it could be too much. But they have something in common, which is that they're either necessary for survival, so food or sex are necessary either for the individual to survive or obviously for the species to reproduce, or they turn out to be very dangerous, or they could be chemicals that promote dopaminergic transmission and therefore can become addictive. So these are the kinds of stimuli that traditionally have been employed in studies of the reward system and of pleasure. And when we first started doing this research, we noticed that music was not part of this, right? So we just had no idea whether music would be engaging a similar system or not. And that system is a very complex system that I'm obviously oversimplifying here, but it consists of the striatum, which is found in these deep nuclei, so portions of the basal ganglia. In particular, the caudate and the nucleus accumbens are important components here, as well as a variety of different brainstem nuclei, the ventral tegmental area and medial forebrain bundle, and some cortical areas, the medial prefrontal cortex in particular. This whole system is mediated via dopamine, especially in the nucleus accumbens. And a concept that comes out of this literature, mostly from the animal literature actually, by people like Wolfram Schultz and others, is that these systems are encoding reward prediction error. So it's not just the reward, but rather the way that the reward fits into what you anticipate will happen. So if you teach a rat to expect food to a certain cue, then the cue itself will become will show activity in these dopamine neurons, but also the size of the reward will be a factor, so that if you get a larger than expected reward, you will get a boost in the dopamine response. If you get less than predicted reward, you'll get an inhibition of those dopamine neurons. And that, I think, turns out to be an important concept that I'll come back to in a moment. So it's not just animal studies, but in fact human studies have shown a convergence of activity in the striatum and related structures for a variety of different kinds of rewarding stimuli. This is from a meta-analysis by Guillaume Sescus and his group. And what they did was they looked at studies using monetary reward. So these are sort of gambling studies. They looked at food reward studies. These are all fMRI experiments where people either receive food or view a picture of food or have the promise that they will receive food later on. And erotic rewards, so basically people looking at erotic stimuli. And you see that there's a common theme here. So all of them show responses in the striatum, as well as in this ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the sort of pregenual anterior cingulate. So there's a common circuitry that's activated by all of these stimuli. Similarly, we know from drug studies that a variety of drugs also engage the striatum, and in particular engage the dopaminergic system in the striatum. So these are different studies by actually colleagues of mine at McGill who have studied the dopaminergic response to cocaine, to amphetamine, and to alcohol. And you see that it's really very similar. So it's always in the striatal region. So back in 2000, I had a very clever postdoctoral fellow, Anne Blood, who's now a researcher at Harvard. And she suggested that maybe we should study music to see if it would engage the same system. And I thought this was incredibly risky, and I said, Anne, are you sure you should do this? And she said, yeah, well, I think we should. So how are we going to study it? Because it's very subjective. What gives one person pleasure? What gives another person pleasure? And we got to thinking that one way to study it is to look at this phenomenon of musical chills. So when you hear highly pleasurable music, regardless of what music it is, you get chills. And actually the way we came to this is because she's actually a drummer in a death metal band, and I play, keyboard music from the early 17th century. And the only thing we had in common was that we both get chills at a certain moment of the music. And so we thought this is really cool because it's a stable response, and we can measure some psychophysiological indices that are associated with it. You don't have to be a trained musician, so people can experience this even without any musical training. How many of you know what I'm talking about? How many of you have experienced chills to music? So most people have experienced it at some point. It's often very specific to a particular musical passage, which makes it very useful experimentally because we know when it will happen. And it's usually described as in very positive terms, as euphoric, ecstatic, highly pleasurable. And I just want to give you a sampling of some of the music that we use, because for this experimental paradigm, we asked each participant to bring in the music that they had, that they liked the most. So this gives you some idea of what they brought in. So that's not too controversial, I don't think. That's Beethoven, of course. This one is a little different. It still doesn't really give me chills, but how many of you like that sort of techno? It's probably a little dated by now, right? That's like from the middle 1990s, so none of you guys listen to that anymore. It's passé. How about this? That's kind of a cool jazz. And then this one is sort of interesting. Sorry, this one's not working. Okay, well, you get the idea, which is that these stimuli vary enormously in all of their acoustical and sensory properties, but what they have in common is that the response that people get is similar. And so that's the way we got around the huge individual variation, because that's another problem that we were facing just experimentally. How do you study something where people, have such a variety of responses? So to try to demonstrate that the physiological responses were a good index of what was going on, we did the following. We took the excerpts that people identified as being pleasurable, and we asked them to rate with a slider when they were experiencing pleasure, and to indicate by pressing a button when a chill occurred. And so you see that the pleasurable excerpts compared to the neutral excerpts, of course, elicit more pleasure, subjectively speaking, and when the chill occurs, it corresponds to a peak in the subjective response. And then we measured psychophysiologically the skin conductance response, skin temperature, heart rate, et cetera, and what we find is that there's a very nice correspondence between the subjective response, shown here, and the different measures. So skin conductance goes up, heart rate goes up, respiration rate goes up, skin temperature goes down. That's why they call it chills, because it feels like a chill. It's actually vasoconstriction of the peripheral skin. So there's a good correspondence between the physiology and the subjective ratings, which is important, I think, to bridge that gap a little bit between what people tell you and what's actually happening. So we've done various experiments along these lines, but the one that I want to focus on is the one where we actually measured the dopamine response. And let me just back up for a moment, because there's a slide here that I want to show you. So this is just to show you how the methodology works. So we're using, this is not fMRI, this is using positron emission tomography, and we're using a radioactive tracer called raclopride, which has a carbon-11 positron emitter on it. And raclopride is a synthetic molecule which binds to the dopamine D2 receptors. So it's been used in many previous studies. So what happens is we scan people on 2 different days when they either hear the pleasurable music or some kind of control music. And the way we did the experiment is that we balance these out so that the music that's neutral for me is maybe the music that you brought in that gave you chills, and the music that you brought in that gave you chills is the music that's neutral for me. So it was kind of counterbalanced in that way. So people listen to the music for 15 minutes, excuse me. And the idea is that during that time, this sort of represents a synapse. During that time, if it's a music that you really like, the hypothesis is that there's a lot of dopamine release. Whereas if it's music that you don't really care about, there should be relatively little dopamine release. We then inject our carbon-11 raclopride, so it's our labeled molecule, and the idea is that here, because there's been a lot of dopamine release, there should be relatively few receptor sites on the postsynaptic element, and so therefore there should be relatively low signal coming from those positron-emitting ligands, whereas here there should be a much greater availability of receptor sites. So we should see a stronger signal here than here. So at that point we start our scan, which lasts 60 minutes. It's quite a long, slow procedure. And this procedure, by the way, only has affinity for dopamine receptor sites in the basal ganglia and not in the cortex. So we're basically blind to what's going on in the cortex here. So we got 2 maps which show the dopamine binding potential in the 2 situations. We then compare them and look at the difference between them. And that's what's shown here. And so we do indeed see that there is enhanced dopamine binding going on in the striatum when we have musically induced peak pleasure. And this is work done by Valerie Salampour, who was a PhD student in my lab a couple of years ago. And if we compare this, let's say, to one of the drug scans that we saw before, this is from the amphetamine experiment, we see that there's a very similar pattern of response. Although if you look closely, you'll see there are some differences. In particular, with the music, there's more widespread activity both in more ventral and more dorsal portions of the striatum. And so we wondered what that's about. And I mentioned the PET scan is 60 minutes long, which is very slow. And so we wanted to examine the time course of this activity in a little more detail. And so to do that, we took the same participants who had already had a PET scan and scanned them with fMRI while they're hearing the same stimuli that they had previously heard in the PET experiment. And then we look at the conjunction between these two sets of data as a function of time. And remember, we know when the maximum pleasure occurs because the person presses a button to tell us that they've experienced a chill. And if you look at the time period before versus after, we see a nice anatomical dissociation. So during the period of time preceding the chill, the maximum activity is actually in the dorsal striatum, so part of the caudate nucleus here, whereas after the chill, the maximum activity is in the ventral striatum. And you see that in the time course here. For about 15 seconds or so, the maximum activity is in the dorsal striatum during what we call the anticipation phase. Then it goes down, whereas the ventral striatum does show an increase throughout that period, but really then shows its maximum increase during what we call the experiential phase, which is when people are actually feeling the peak pleasure. So this is a very interesting distinction because it fits in to a number of different models. And if we go back to the animal literature, we see that the idea of a difference between dorsal and ventral striatum fits in rather well with what some of the neuroanatomists have suggested, which is that the dorsal striatum, due to its connectivity, may be more involved in higher order cognitive kinds of processes because it's connected more to anterior cingulate regions, prefrontal cortex regions, areas involved in higher order processes such as prediction, anticipation, decision making, and so forth. Whereas the ventral striatum might be considered a more affective part of the striatum. It's connected to structures like the amygdala, ventromedial frontal cortex, and various brainstem nuclei, which may have to do more with the actual experience of pleasure or, for that matter, other emotions. So the anatomical distinction maps rather well onto what anatomists have suggested. But it turns out that this distinction that I'm showing here between the anticipation of the pleasure and the experience of the pleasure also has an interesting relationship to music theory. Because when we presented these results to our friends who are music theoreticians, they said to us, well, haven't you read the book by Leonard Meyer from 1956 called Emotion in Music? Emotion and Meaning in Music, actually, where he basically says that emotions in music arise from the fulfillment or the suspension of musical expectancies. So there's the idea that is very common in music of creating tension and then resolving that tension. And the predictions that we have are based on our implicit knowledge of musical structure, so that we know what to expect, as I showed you in one of those earlier experiments, even for music that we've never heard before. And then what a good musical piece does for you is it plays with these expectations by creating tension and then resolving it to a greater or to a lesser degree. And this may also be related to this idea of reward prediction error. It's something we're actively working on in the lab at the moment, the idea that a good piece of music, you actually get a reward, quote unquote, which is better than what you expected. And that's actually very difficult to quantify in experimental terms, but it seems to fit with this idea. And if you look at the way that musicians play music, they also seem to be exploiting this concept, because very often there will be delays or there will be additional sounds placed in such a way as to create a particular tension and then resolve it. So I'm almost at the end here, but I want to tell you about one last study, also carried out by Valerie Salimpour in my lab, where we wanted to get away from the musical chills paradigm, because we're very happy with the musical chills. It's worked very well for us. It's always been a good way to look at high pleasure, but it's subject to some critiques. First of all, people say, well, the chills are fine, but not everyone gets them, and even people who get them don't get them all the time. They get them once in a while. So that doesn't really explain most of music listening. But most of the time when we're listening to music, we don't experience chills. Second critique, in those experiments, people were listening to music that they were already familiar with. So maybe there's some kind of contribution of familiarity, and what you're really looking at is maybe some kind of associative memory or some other memory-related phenomenon. So we wanted to get away from that, and Valerie came up with this very clever paradigm, which is a music purchasing paradigm. We also call it the iTunes experiment, because it works just like iTunes. You hear 30 seconds of a musical excerpt, and you have to say, after you've heard it, how much money you would be willing to put down to buy a recording of that piece of music. Okay? So we selected people who liked a certain genre of music. We had them listen to something like 75 different excerpts of music, and there was all new music that they had never heard before. We made sure of this by finding very obscure bands that had just uploaded some music onto their website a few days before the experiment. And to give you a sense of what the music was like, let me play you a few excerpts. That one's really awful, isn't it? How about this one? I kind of like that one now. That's by a band called Totally Extinct Dinosaurs, in case you're interested. So the way the experiment unfolds is each person listens to a 30-second excerpt of music. We acquire a brain scan. We then ask them, how much money would you give? They say 0 for this one. Then they go on to the second excerpt, same thing, and so on. Second subject, same thing. And then each of these dollar values is used as a regressor on the brain activity. So in other words, we're going to look throughout the brain for brain regions whose activity scales as a function of the dollar amount that has been bid. So it's essentially a way of we're using the monetary value as a way of estimating the reward value of the music. And if you think that this is, very much a capitalist view of music, it absolutely is. So what we find is that indeed the nucleus accumbens is one of the areas whose activity scales very nicely as a function of the reward value that's associated with it. So this shows that this reward-related area is not just active during peak pleasure, during these chills, and not just active to familiar music, it's actually related to the reward value as estimated by our monetary bid. But what's, I think, even more interesting in this experiment is that we then looked at how the functional connectivity varies between this region and all other areas of the brain as the reward value increases. So we're looking at the degree to which the reward region is enhancing its functional connectivity with the rest of the brain for highly valued music versus low valued music. And what we find, among other structures that I don't have time to tell you about, is a huge correlation with the auditory cortex, meaning that there is much more interaction between the reward system and the auditory cortex for items that are highly valued compared to items that are not so valued. And this finding, I think, is really important because it brings together, essentially, the two systems that I've been talking about in today's lecture. So it brings together the perceptual system with all of its bells and whistles and all of its perceptual and cognitive capacities, including the ability to make predictions and to create expectancies about those events, brings it together with the reward system. So this is some kind of very complex loop whose properties we certainly do not understand at this moment, but I want to advance the hypothesis that maybe music represents a mechanism by which we have figured out how to enhance our emotional arousal system, in particular our reward system, via the interaction of this phylogenetically very ancient system, which has to do with reward, has to do with other properties. Some people refer to it as a salience network or evaluation system. It's mostly striatal and limbic and paralimbic. So somehow that system interacts with the more phylogenetically advanced cortical loops that have to do with not only perceiving sounds and encoding those sounds, but also generating predictions about how those patterns will unfold over time. And this, I think, is perhaps, like I said, it's just a hypothesis, but it's perhaps a good model to try to think about aesthetic rewards in general, how we have both the phylogenetically ancient and the more advanced systems working together. And so to close, I just want to thank all of my various colleagues who've contributed to this, and of course to all the students who've done all the work. And thank you so much for your attention, and congratulations again to all of the graduates. Thank you.
This was a super stimulating talk. Can I have a couple of questions?
Of course, sure, if you have time.
Yeah, I think we actually have time for a couple of questions. So,
Thank you very much. It was a very beautiful talk. I'm not sure I understood clearly if your perspective is that music rely on a modular system. So basically that there is a specific set of regions that support uniquely or more specifically music. Or if music relies on systems like primary auditory cortex for pitch, I mean, or we can speak about like a voice selective region, which is also pitch and harmonicity across time, or the language system that also has some kind of computation that are similar to music. So is music built on this system, or is music as a specific set of?
Yeah, I have not used the word modular, and I would not use it anyway, and I especially wouldn't use it with Professor Karamatsa here. So I don't really think it's necessary to propose it. In other words, I think we can explain all of the phenomena that we have without recourse to a true, encapsulated, unique system that doesn't do anything else. I also don't think it's very plausible in terms of evolutionary concepts. I think it's more plausible to think that each of these elements that I've discussed probably emerged to solve particular problems associated with environmental events and survival. So, the ability to track pitch, for instance, we know, in fact, that pitch-sensitive areas are found in various other species, at least in macaques, for sure, and in marmosets also, which are very distantly related to humans. And it doesn't have to have anything to do with music. It just has to do with the fact that periodicity is a very salient stimulus in the environment, and it's very important to be able to identify it because it serves as a cue to, for instance, conspecific vocalizations. So there's a very good reason why it might have emerged, why a system devoted to encoding periodicity in a sound stream, which has nothing to do with music. That's on the one hand. The reward system clearly emerged for various reasons having to do with survival, so that you have cues that tell you, you know, that if something tastes good, you should eat it, or to give you sex drive so that it will be pleasurable, so that there will be reproduction. So each of these elements, you can think of lots of scenarios whereby they might have developed. And then I sort of like the idea that many people have proposed, that once you have all these elements in place, then they can interact, even though they weren't necessarily selected for directly. But once they're in place, those pathways already exist. You can use them for something like music. I still don't think that that means that it has to be, that any one of those elements has to be uniquely for music. And actually, I don't really know I don't think there's very good evidence to suggest that it should be unique. I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
Beautiful lecture, thank you. You emphasized pleasure. What about sadness?
What about?
Sadness.
Sense?
Sadness. To be
Oh,
sad.
sadness, yes.
I listen to some music and I can barely hold back the tears.
Yes.
Where does that come from?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's not one that we've studied, mostly because we haven't thought of a clever way. We haven't been clever enough to come up with a way to study it. But I think there's a few ideas that are out there. So, you know, the most common proposal is that if you think of music as one of its functions having to do with mood regulation, you want to be able not only to upregulate your mood, but also to downregulate it. And so if you think of it in the context of, and this is a big oversimplification, but if you think of it in the context of, let's say, achieving homeostasis, well, something like sad music has properties which may be useful in down-regulating your mood. I don't think that captures everything, however, because there's also the opposite concept, which is that music and other forms of art, for that matter, can also be used to potentiate your mood. And so both things are sort of at play, and this is where it becomes very difficult to think of a good experimental approach. But it has been shown, for instance, just by questionnaires, that people often will listen to sad music when they themselves are sad. And the sadder they are, the more they don't want to be lifted out. So if, you know, someone that you love has just died, you probably don't want to listen to upbeat music. You want to reflect on what has happened. And so actually music in that case will potentiate the state. So those two things are kind of opposite, and it's difficult to, I haven't figured out yet how to integrate them. So if you have any ideas, let me know. Oh, there's one more.
Last question?
Okay, thank you for the lecture. And what about looking at the chemicals directly? That I don't know if there's any way to look at the chemicals that are released while one subject listens to music, if they are similar to the one released while having sex or eating food or something. And another question would be, about religion, and there are some cultures which use music for praying, to pray, and also Tuvan throat singing, for example, shamanic cultures. So it's some different kind of emotions evoked, like ecstasies. I don't know if there's such a word.
Yes.
So what about this? If there's something done, some research.
I'm not sure there's very much research. I'm certainly not an expert on music and religion, despite a few slides that I showed. I think, again, because music can evoke different mental states, I think religions have, in many, many cultures, have tended to use it in order to enhance the whatever service it is. There's also, I think, another reason why music is very commonly used in religions, which is many religions have some kind of sacred text, and often the sacred text needs to be read out loud by multiple people. And as soon as you have a group of people reading a fixed set of words, they have to coordinate with each other, right? So it means that they're going to suddenly have the same rhythm, and probably they will adjust their pitch as well. So if you have a group of people reciting the same repeated text every day that they're coming to engage in some religious ceremony, you almost have group singing emerging from that, almost necessarily. With respect to your first question, with this PET technique, you can actually track neurochemicals in vivo, non-invasively. So that's what we've done. But there are other ways to look at this. And one project that we're going to try, I have a postdoc working on this at the moment, is to try to modulate dopaminergic activity using TMS. So there is a technique that's already been shown and published 15 years ago, that if you stimulate a certain portion of dorsolateral frontal cortex with transcranial magnetic stimulation with a particular frequency, you will see a change in dopamine release in the striatum, because there are very strong connections between dorsolateral frontal cortex and striatum. So what we'd like to do is see if we can actually modulate the dopamine content via the TMS, and then see if that has the predicted consequence on the musical pleasure. Because everything that I've shown you is subject to the critique that it's correlational. So I haven't done any I haven't shown you any data for a direct causal effect. So that's one way that we're going to try to approach that.
Okay, so thank you very much for this beautiful talk. Now, before I leave the word to the director of CIMEC, let me thank Lea Mercanti, who put a lot of effort in always put a lot of effort in the activities related to the PhD program. And the reason why the PhD program is often appreciated by the students is also because the administrative part is working very well. So thank you very much, Lea. And I now leave the microphone to the director of CIMEC, Professor Massimo Turato.
Le poche parole che vi dirò saranno in italiano, ma dopo 3 anni in Italia sono sicuro che sarete in grado di seguire quello che ho da dirvi. Cari dottori di ricerca, questo è il vostro giorno ed è un giorno importante per il vostro futuro, e su questo vorrei spendere tra poche parole. Prima però consentitemi di rivolgere il mio ringraziamento personale di tutto il CIMEC, che ho l'onore di rappresentare, ad alcune figure chiave per il nostro dottorato di ricerca. Alla Fondazione Caritro, che negli anni ha contribuito con un sostanziale finanziamento alle nostre borse di dottorato. Al direttore della scuola di dottorato, il professor Francesco Pavani, e a Lea, appena menzionata, per l'egregio lavoro che stanno svolgendo, perché attraverso questo lavoro che voi spesso non vedete, che il vostro percorso di dottorato è risultato, come spero, una bella esperienza formativa. Grazie anche ai vostri supervisor, perché se siete qui oggi lo dovete anche a loro. Ed infine direi che devo ringraziare voi perché con la vostra energia e impegno siete stati parte integrante e fondamentale della ricerca di alto livello che viene quotidianamente condotta nei laboratori del CIMEC. Dopo aver esaurito questi doverosi e sentiti ringraziamenti, vorrei passare alla parte del mio messaggio che è rivolta a voi, neodottori di ricerca e futuri colleghi. Mi sono chiesto in questi giorni che cosa avrei potuto dirvi in questa occasione e mi è venuto in mente, non so perché, una frase che disse un famoso maestro di spada giapponese qualche secolo fa, e disse: solo la fine delle cose è importante. Mi sono sempre chiesto quale fosse il senso di una frase che in effetti sembra un po' controintuitiva. In effetti siamo spesso portati a vivere la fine delle cose in uno di due modi: o in modo triste, perché vorremmo che quello che stiamo vivendo non finisse, o con un certo sollievo legato al fatto che vogliamo sbarazzarci in più in fretta possibile di un'esperienza negativa. Credo invece che il suggerimento insito nella frase sia quello di prestare attenzione e di celebrare la fine delle cose. E se ci pensate, è proprio questo che siamo qui oggi a celebrare, la fine del vostro percorso di dottorato. Tuttavia penso che la parte meno ovvia della frase sia che si debba prestare attenzione alla fine delle cose per dare loro il giusto valore, perché da lì possiamo ripartire per qualcosa di nuovo. Ma la nuova avventura, credo, avrà successo solo se saremo stati capaci di aver fatto tesoro della nostra esperienza precedente. In fondo, noi scienziati della mente umana sappiamo che spesso si imparano le cose solo se ci si presta attenzione. E allora il mio messaggio vuole essere un messaggio che cerca di dirvi come legare assieme quello che è stato e quello che sarà, molto probabilmente per molti di voi il futuro prossimo, che vi vedrà lavorare come giovani ricercatori nel campo delle scienze cognitive e delle neuroscienze. Quello che voglio dirvi è che se ci prestate attenzione dovete essere consapevoli che avete davanti a voi la possibilità di fare un lavoro meraviglioso, nel quale studierete la mente umana e le basi nervose su cui si fonda, cioè il cervello. Proprio il cervello ha consentito ad alcuni esemplari della nostra specie, la specie umana, noti come scienziati, di scoprire le leggi della natura, descritta mirabilmente dalla fisica, dalla chimica, dalla biologia. Ma voi potete essere una specie particolare di scienziati, quelli che studiano quali leggi della natura regolano l'oggetto che ha scoperto dalle leggi, cioè la mente umana. Per fare questo dovete essere coraggiosi e determinati, perché non diventerete ricchi facendo questo lavoro. Dovete imparare ad essere pazienti, perché spesso, come forse avrete già avuto modo di vedere, i risultati non arrivano subito. Soprattutto in questi casi, perseverate, credete nelle vostre idee, che devono nascere da uno studio serio di quanto già scoperto da altri colleghi prima di voi. In questo senso, da oggi non sarete più ufficialmente studenti, ma dovete rimanere degli studiosi. Però, se dopo aver studiato un problema pensate di avere nuove idee, non preoccupatevi di sfidare il sapere consolidato. Credete nelle vostre idee e andate avanti. Combinare assieme coraggio, determinazione, pazienza richiede una grossa passione, perché non potete fare questo lavoro se non avete una passione per la ricerca, se non vi trovate di notte a non prendere sonno perché vi è venuta in mente una nuova idea e vorreste già avere pronti i dati per poterli analizzare. Per quanto riguarda quindi il vostro futuro, non smettete mai di credere in voi stessi e nelle vostre idee. È l'unica seria possibilità che avete. E non preoccupatevi troppo dell'eventuale diffidenza degli altri. La fine di una situazione, di un'esperienza, se ci prestiamo la dovuta attenzione, ci può suggerire il nuovo percorso. Ed è questa la vostra nuova sfida da affrontare rimanendo curiosi, appassionati e senza paura di rompere gli schemi, se sarà necessario. Vi lascio quindi facendo miei due incoraggiamenti, due ammonimenti che diventano un augurio e che qualche tempo fa sono stati rivolti da Stephen Jobs agli studenti di dottorato di Stanford durante una cerimonia analoga a quella odierna. Stay hungry, stay foolish. Buona fortuna a tutti quanti voi. Lascio la parola al professore De Florian, prorettore.
Okay. In Italian, in English, I don't know, maybe a few words in English, just to congratulate you for the achievement of your PhD. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to be here today representing the University of Trento as Deputy Rector in this important moment in your life, but also an important moment for our university, because I think that every end of PhD, it's a milestone for a university. If it's a milestone for your life, but it's a milestone also for the university. Poche parole anche in italiano. Diciamo che la fine del dottorato è un momento molto importante che credo che per chi insegna all'università abbia un sapore particolare, perché significa vedere crescere delle persone fino a diventare quasi, appunto, dei colleghi, quasi delle persone che hanno raggiunto il livello e speriamo supereranno, con rispetto per tutti, supereranno il livello dei docenti che avranno avuto. Questo è un momento importante, credo che sia importante celebrarlo degnamente come stiamo facendo qui e come credo sarebbe importante fare ogni volta che ci troviamo in questa situazione. Yes, something is finishing, but something is starting also, as mentioned by Professor Turato just a few minutes ago. So I hope that you will bring a piece of your experience in Trento when you will be around the world, and I hope that some of you can continue the work and research and science in the same place we were in the last 3 years. Congratulations again.
I get the microphone this year. For a little bit, I would also personally like to thank and would really appreciate you joining in an applause for 3 wonderful, excellent years spent with Professor Pavani as head of the PhD program, and with the wish that he will do another 3 years, because that is possible. But in any case, to thank him so much for the 3 years that he has put into this PhD program, which has brought it to definitely an excellent level, and there's still lots to be done, but it's been a pleasure. So please help me thanking him. Sorry, without further ado, it is now your turn, Elisa, Daniel, Tofik, Yuan, and Raffaele. Please welcome me in congratulating Elisa Infanti. Thank you. Daniel Sebastian Kaiser. Nasif Tofik. And Yuan Tao. And Raffaele Tucciarelli. And I will go ahead and invite everyone to the refreshments downstairs. Thank you all.